Hello, I'm Fred Kemp, President and CEO of the Atlantic Council, and I'd like to welcome you to the Atlantic Council front page, or hashtag AC front page, our primary and premier live ideas platform for global leaders. And welcome to our audience in the United States and across the world across myriad platforms. Today, it's our profound pleasure to welcome House Majority Whip James E. Clyburn, the third ranking Democrat in the House, to discuss the domestic underpinnings of American foreign policy. Congressman Clyburn is in his 14th term representing South Carolina's 6th district. That covers parts of Charleston, Columbia, and many rural parts of South Carolina as well. I'm delighted that our own Damon Wilson, the Atlantic Council Executive Vice President, will moderate this event. He's a native of Charleston, Congressman. In fact, he has family there and he just returned on a plane this morning. I'm also delighted that closing the event will be another South Carolinian, Clintandra Thompson. She is one of our aces in our communications department. But she's also the co-chair of our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council. So we're going to be looking forward to hearing Clintandra at the end of this event. For our international viewers and listeners, this event underscores a conviction we have at the Atlantic Council that it has always been the power of the American example that provides us credibility abroad or not. Thus, we are going to spend more time at the Atlantic Council, underpinnings of our international standing. It is our view that Americans will be unable to shape the international order if they, Americans, fail to address key issues concerning our national disorder, whether it be bias in all its forms, political polarization, failing infrastructure, or any of the many issues for which Congressman Clyburn has been one of our country's most respected voices. Congressman Clyburn has played a pivotal role this year, endorsing Democratic candidate Joe Biden 3 days before the South Carolina primary that changed the trajectory of the race in his favor. Congressman Clyburn, you are an individual whose life story is both the story of American problems being overcome by you personally and American progress. Just a few days ago, in pushing the Senate to take up the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which has been passed by the House, you said, quote, "This legislation gives us an opportunity to live up to what Alexis de Tocqueville observed about Americans' greatness when he wrote, quote, America is not great because it is more enlightened than any other nation, but rather because it has always been able to repair its faults." The continuation of your quote, "It is long overdue for us to repair some faults in our policing system and apply the greatness of America equitably to all of our citizens," end quote. This event today is hosted by the Scowcroft Center's New Engagement Initiative. Really delighted that the director, Chris Preble, is here as is his right hand, Agaki. This new American Engagement Initiative aims to question conventional assumptions governing U.S. foreign policy and offer real-world solutions to urgent problems that deploy the full range of American diplomatic, economic, and other capabilities. Your life experience, Congressman, your critical role in Congress, and your leadership on a wide range of issues make you the perfect guest to help us together uncover and discuss how America can better lead by renewing its social contract at home. Thank you for being with us today. We all look forward to the conversation. Damon, over to you for you two South Carolinians to engage in a conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Fred, for that warm introduction. As he said, I'm not just here today as a Atlantic Council staff member, but as a proud South Carolinian. Mr. Congressman, I'm really delighted to have with us House Majority Whip Jim Clyburn. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your service. And thank you for coming on the show today. I wanted to pick up where Fred sort of framed this. This is really an important body of work for the Atlantic Council to take a look at the domestic strengths or weaknesses of the United States and how that influences our role in the world. This is part of a new commitment of the Atlantic Council to double down on understanding the connection between what happens here at home and our standing in the world. And can I just ask you off the top, just how do you see this connection between what happens on the streets of America and how that reflects in terms of our leadership on the world stage today?
Well, first of all, let me thank all of you so much for having me. Thank you, Mr. Kemp, for your leadership of the Atlantic Council, and thanks to you, Damon, and not just for moderating today, but for your family relationship that I've enjoyed over so many years. It's not often that I get to appear on a program like this with two South Carolinians, two homies. So thank you so much for being here as well. I thought it's kind of interesting that Mr. Kemp opened up his presentation today, quoting from one of my favorite people of history, Alexis de Tocqueville. I have studied de Tocqueville since my college days, and his two-volume work, which is kind of interesting, was written back in the 1830s, when the country was still wrestling with the institution of slavery. But even then, he, the Frenchman, having come here to visit, to study our penal system, really detected what he said was a certain magic about this country. And he set out to find the source of that magic. He went around the country quite a bit, visiting various institutions, legislative halls, and he came to the conclusion that you just heard today, that this country is great, not so much because we are more enlightened than any other nation, but rather because we've always been able to repair our faults. And I think that recent experiences here in the country with this pandemic has demonstrated that there are some significant fault lines in the country. And the question now becomes whether or not we are going to be able to repair those faults. As de Tocqueville said we were able to do. That's what the Emancipation Proclamation was all about, repairing a fault. That's what Brown v. Board of Education was all about, which started in the courts, at least, there in Charleston, South Carolina, but started out with activities of local community, Clarendon County, South Carolina. I knew all of those people, and they were not looking for anything more than a chance, an opportunity to make sure that their children would be able to enjoy access and I would say to this country's greatness and be able to afford it. So I think that what we have to do now is to pay close attention to what this country professes to be and determine that we are going to live out those creeds. When I was growing up, I grew up in the little town of Sumter, South Carolina. And I was growing up at the time we used to recite the pledge every morning, the Pledge of Allegiance. In fact, I got to know that pledge very well because I was a grade school kid when we changed the pledge to include the words "under God." And I remember having to repeat that pledge a whole lot for leaving out those two words. With liberty and justice for all is the way it ends. And so the question is, that is a great creed, but are we doing all we can to live out that creed with liberty and justice for all? And so I think that what we have to do is take a look at the creeds, take a look at that preamble to our Constitution, and ask ourselves the question, are we doing everything that's possible in pursuit of a more perfect union? And I think the answer to that question would be no, we aren't. And then the question is whether or not we are going to take that upon ourselves to do, to fulfill all of that. I know this, that we live in different times today. There may have been a time in our history when we could profess one thing and do another, as we've done so often. But that's not going to be the future. We're at a different time now. There are things that connect us to the rest of the world, and we are going to be made to account for our successes or lack thereof. And so I would hope that we begin to pay close attention to what this country professes and begin to do the things that are necessary to live them out.
Thank you, Congressman. Each year, the Atlantic Council actually partners with the Tocqueville Foundation and hosts the conversations of Tocqueville in his home in Normandy. And it's helpful to have, sometimes foreigners look in and see our strengths and our weaknesses.
Sure.
But as you look forward here, you've talked about the nation's founding principles while they were imperfect in their application throughout our history. How do you think some of these principles of rule of law or individual liberty, how do they shape our role in the world? How do they actually guide foreign policy, where some might argue that they should be separate from our foreign policy?
No, I don't think you can possibly separate our practices from the things that we profess. We've always held ourselves out as I think Ronald Reagan would say, that shine and light on the hill. And that's what the country has always professed to be. And I think in large measure the country has been that. But we've never been really held to account for whether or not all of our practices borne that out. I think that in the future, going forward, that is going to be the case. The world is getting smaller and smaller every day. And as a result of that, things that we say and do are heard and seen instantaneously around the world. So our challenge is going to be whether or not we are going to live up to those things, because you can't separate the two. We just cannot believe for one moment that we are going to have a domestic policy on one track and foreign policy on another track, and never the twain shall meet. That's not going to be the case. My dad used to tell me all the time, is the son, you lead by precept and example. Now, policies, the expression of policies, no matter how good they are, they're precepts. But in order for us to be leaders, we're going to have to demonstrate examples. No, we're not going to be able to separate those two. They are going to be an integral part of our relationships with people around the world. And I would hope that we would get serious about making sure that we live out those creeds.
You mentioned the Brown versus Board of Education landmark case, one of those cases sort of growing out of South Carolina. But at the time, the Atlantic Council's founder, one of the founders, Dean Acheson, was Secretary of State for Harry Truman. And he filed an amicus brief in that case, Brown versus Board of Education, arguing as Secretary of State that racial discrimination in the United States jeopardized our leadership, our moral leadership of the free and democratic nations of the world. How does inequality in the United States today impair our leadership on the world stage today?
Well, it does the same as it did then. You know, one of these awards I've got in here is from the Truman Foundation. Truman is my favorite president in history. I'm a big fan of Truman. In fact, I keep two books at my bedside. One, of course, is the Bible. I grew up in a parsonage, and I do sometimes wonder what would Jesus do when I look at issues. But the other book that I keep is McCullough's book on Truman. And I often ask myself, what would Harry do? So that Dean Acheson was one of my favorite people. I'm old enough to remember all of that. In fact, my first real activity in politics came right at the end of Truman's tenure in office. And he's what got me interested. His 1948 race is what really got me into politics. Because I just thought that there was something interesting about this little guy from Missouri that nobody thought had a chance of getting elected president. He is running against this wealthy scion from New York. And of course, I wasn't the only one sure that he couldn't win. I think the Chicago papers were so sure about it, they printed the headlines before the votes were even counted. Of course, it tells a little bit about the headlines in newspapers. But I do believe that what Dean Acheson was saying was he knew from his experiences in that administration how this whole issue of race relations was affecting his job of trying to carry out this country's mission around the world. And I think that is even more so today, because back then, it might be days before anybody would find out what was going on here in the country if it were contrary to what we profess. Not so today, as I said earlier. These things are instantaneous now, so I think there's even more of a problem for us today than it was then. Those families, there were five, as you know, there are five cases folded into the so-called Brown case, or Briggs case coming out of South Carolina. But I've often talked, and this is one you mentioned earlier about my endorsement of Joe Biden. Well, the fact of the matter is, that's how I really got to know Joe Biden. I got to know Joe Biden us discussing the Brown case, because one of the Brown cases happened to have come out of Delaware. Belton, the case, Belton v. Gephardt, was one of the five. And that's how we really got to know each other discussing that case. And we often talk about how my growing up in the little town of Sumter, South Carolina, his growing up there in Delaware, and the relationships that we had with our studies and what may or may not have been true about so much of what we were studying. But I was the same way when I was teaching school. I started my professional career as a public school teacher. A lot of times I stood before classes saying things to students, and sometimes I would go home and regret having said it because I didn't telling them that they could be anything they wanted to be. I didn't really believe all of that because the practices were different. But it's even more challenging today.
So I wanted to just ask about the state of democracy in the world. According to Freedom House, we've been in a democratic recession, and you've seen the growth of authoritarians, some backsliding among democracies globally. And Senator Chris Murphy published a piece earlier this summer saying this moment, perhaps a new civil rights movement, this anti-racist movement in our country today, it could potentially be a foreign policy win for America if it empowered us to help lead the advance of democracies on the global stage. This has obviously been a priority for candidate Biden, who's talked about a potential of a summit of democracies if he were to win. Do you see the potential to reverse the backsliding globally of what's happening with democracies and have the United States be a force in the advance of democracies in the future if we get our act together at home?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I know Chris very well. I'm not aware of that publication of his, but I'm certainly going to make myself aware of it and become familiar with it after today. I do believe that. As you know, I had a very close relationship with John Lewis, one that started back in 1960. And John and I often talk about that, the faith that he had in this country, even the experiences that he had gone through. My experience was nothing like John's were. He still held on to that faith that this country could still be a beacon for the rest of the world. And I'm convinced that we are going to be that. In spite of how things may seem now, this pandemic, within the pandemic that we're going through, this world health crisis, we may be lagging now in our response to COVID-19, but I do believe that this is a challenge that we're going to overcome. And I believe very strongly that we are going to once again take our place as a leader across the world, as not just a leader, but the leader. Certainly we can do that. It's going to take having to come back from some things, but we've done that before. The so-called Reconstruction era that we all talk about a lot didn't last for 12 years. After the end of Reconstruction, we lapsed into a long period of apartheid. We call it Jim Crow, but we know that's what it was. But we came back from that. A lot of people talk about the 60s being the second Reconstruction. I don't know if I would call it that, but there are setbacks. They were overcome in the 50s and the 60s. There may be setbacks today. We're going to overcome this. I have faith and confidence that the country will survive this and will be that beacon on the hill.
Congressman, the Atlantic Council is a place that welcomes friends and allies. We welcome our guests from overseas routinely, and we often hear their concern about what political dysfunction, the political polarization here, causing folks to question the efficacy of our democracy, the efficacy of our governance. You've been heavily involved in this and how to improve the mechanics of Congress, our democracy, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Do you see a prospect for how to fix the democratic functioning at home to show not just the American people, but to show the world that the United States can still take big decisions, can still get things done, and our democracy can work?
Yes, I do. It is often said that the darkest time of the night is that moment just before dawn. And we are going through a period now of that some people may view as darkness, and I believe that dawn will arrive, and we will overcome this. And I know that there are those who question the efficacy of democracy. There are a lot of people who practice democracy and still wonder whether or not it is the best practice. When I was going to jail back in the 60s, I often wondered while sitting in the jails of Orangeburg and Columbia, whether or not what we were doing was the right thing. But I never lost faith. You may question exactly what it is that you're going through in this particular instance. But I always felt that we would be vindicated and that we would achieve what we set out to achieve. And I do believe that's going to happen again. I always say that this country, not that people people just don't think about it. We usually think about things as moving on a linear plane. We just think it goes from point one, A to point B to point C. But that's not the way any democracy works. The movement of this country is always, I say, like a pendulum on the clock. It goes left and then it goes back right. then it goes back left again. And so it's always that way. If you go back through history, you see that's the way it goes. We go off to the left, it tops out, goes back to the right. I think we saw an indication of that. We went left in 2008 and elected Barack Obama. Then we went back to the right and elected Donald Trump. We immediately started back to the left. And I tell people all the time that I think that what we have to keep in mind, that when the country is moving from left to right, it passes through the center. And it's going from right back left, it passes through the center. So theoretically, we camp out in the center twice as often as we camp out left or right. And that's the stabilizing force. Sometimes center right, left of center right, and left of center left, but always a stabilizing force. And so I know that some people may question what is taking place in the country today, but I believe very strongly that we are going to demonstrate to the other countries around the world that we have the capacity here to stabilize things and then start back on that journey towards creating a more perfect union.
So you're one of the most important leaders in Congress today, and the Constitution, of course, in Article 1 gives Congress a lot of power over questions of peace and war, over foreign policy issues. And yet we've seen the balance recede over time. Congress has an important role of oversight. There's been an active debate on authorization of the use of military force in Congress. How do you see getting this balance right of Congress's role in shaping American foreign policy and national security? Are we in the right place, or does there need to be a rebalance?
Well, we will know on November 4th. I don't know that we are, I would say that we're in the right place today, and that's why we have elections. And I think that we'll know after the November 3rd elections whether or not we're in the right place, whether or not there's still more work to be done, and whether or not we'll start on that work immediately, or whether or not we have to wait another 4 years. But I do believe that no one's going to give up on that pursuit. Makeup of the courts or makeup of legislative bodies, they often seem to balance each other out. Now, if history is any guide, then what I'm saying, there is historical precedence for. Now, I hope that history continues to be a guide. So I think that we're going to do this. History tells us that we will.
So, sir, I'm getting some good questions in. I just want to remind the audience, you can continue to submit your questions at the hashtag AC Front Page. I'm going to bring a few into the conversation. Let me take a couple here that are connected. You, of course, are chairman of the House Select Committee on the Coronavirus Crisis, a pretty signature role at this time in our country. Chris Preble is asking, how is the COVID-19 crisis changing public perceptions about threats to public safety? And how might this impact spending priorities? For example, between the balance between military spending and other spending such as public health. It's sort of related to a question that came in from someone from Missouri who liked your shout out to President Truman, who basically said is this moment, are we able to build political support for an essential Marshall Plan to rebuild our economy? So how do you see this crisis reshaping spending priorities in Congress?
Well, I think it's going to reshape it in a very positive way. I don't know if we'll ever call it a Marshall Plan, but it'll be something akin to it. I do believe that we are going to get serious about doing what's necessary for education to be more adequate than it is today, for healthcare to be more available than it is today, for housing to be more affordable than it is today. I think that this COVID-19 experience has exposed some fault lines. And I do believe that we are going to do what's necessary to repair those fault lines. Let's take the whole issue of broadband. I have been hopping on broadband now for about 10 years. A lot of people just didn't pay a whole lot of attention to it when I first started talking about it. They're paying attention today. Our new infrastructure bill that we call Moving Forward, I think is the big name for it. It has incorporated a broadband program that would build out over 10 years, every home in America being wired to the internet. Because I don't see us being able to solve our healthcare crisis without having telehealth or telemedicine, whichever you prefer to call it. I don't see us being able to have education made adequate without online learning. You can't have any of that without broadband. So I do believe that there are two things going to happen starting next year. We're going to begin to have a network of community health centers that will be, I think, the backbone or the ultimate safety net for providing accessible and affordable health care for all Americans. I think we're going to have broadband in every home within the next 10 years. I think that's going to happen. So that it might look like a Marshall Plan. I doubt that we'll call it that. I've been calling it 10, 20, 30. That is to say that whatever's appropriated, at least 10% of the appropriation should be targeted into those communities where 20% or more of the population's been stuck beneath the poverty level for the last 30 years. Now, the reason we came up with that is because the Census Bureau has determined that any community where 20% or more of the population's been stuck beneath the poverty level for the last 30 years is a persistent poverty community. That's the only way to break up persistent poverty, is to invest the resources in the communities. These are the resources that are needed to have rural hospitals, to have rural schools made adequate, to have broadband. We've got to invest the resources in these communities. So some may call it a Marshall Plan. I'm just calling it 10, 20, 30.
Congress also has a big say on trade issues as well. There's a question about this. You're from South Carolina, a state that has benefited greatly from foreign investment of manufacturers, from BMW, Volvo, Mercedes, the Port of Charleston, all of that commerce coming in, the purchases of Boeing aircraft. But yet there's also a concern about American jobs. We're in the midst of a big debate over tariffs and protectionism in the wake of the coronavirus, reshoring national supply chains. How do you think about this and representing South Carolina? What's the right balance between getting that trade equation right of engaging in commerce in the world, protecting jobs in the United States, protecting important supply chains, yet not cutting off investments that create jobs in a place like South Carolina?
Well, I think that what you do is take a hard look at whether or not you're going to put Main Street on an equal standing with Wall Street. I think that we have to get beyond this mindset of judging the success of our economic system by how well Wall Street does. I've never been able to understand that. To me, if we are going to really do what is necessary to balance all this out, we have got to begin to invest in these communities where people live. I always say that we don't have a real urban crisis in this country. We have a failure of rural policies. If we were to begin to look at the source of these problems and make the investments where they should be made, if we made the schools in rural communities better, have health care available in rural communities, people would not be always looking for the promised land. And that's what create these urban crises, in my opinion, because people are going where they can get their children educated. They're going where they can find jobs. And that's why I'm so pleased with BMW, with Volvo, with Boeing, with Mercedes-Benz. All of these people have come to South Carolina, and all of a sudden now, we are building, making more tires in South Carolina today than they make in Ohio. Who would have thought that 10 years ago? So I think that when we look at where we can make these kinds of investments, then we can get our trade balance back on, because we'll be making these automobiles don't stay in South Carolina. We export them. And these cars go out through the Port of Charleston, going out just yesterday. The largest ship ever came to Charleston. It's there. It's going to be there for a while before going back to its home port of China. This is their last stop off. Why? Because we made the investments. We're now deep in the harbor. We're going down to 52 feet, so we can have these mega ships. So people won't have to go off looking to make a living other places. So we got to make the investments in these communities, and I think the trade balance or the trade will come into balance.
I was home when that ship came in. It was massive indeed.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you if you think our focus needs to be renewal at home, investment in infrastructure and broadband. Does it mean we need to do less in the world? Is there a trade-off between U.S. engagement in the world and investing at home, or is that a false choice?
No, it's not a trade-off. We complement each other. Look, if I can make automobiles that are going to be bought and sold in some other country, I think that's a good thing. We are because we're making it here. It doesn't necessarily stay here. We're making these airplanes that we're making down there at Boeing. We depend upon foreign markets in order for that investment to pay off. And so, no, we can have a balance in all of this. We aren't going to be isolated from the rest of the world. I would hope not. That's not the way you demonstrate that you are that shine a light on the hill. You demonstrate that by remaining a part of the world at large. And there are all kinds of ways to be a part of the world at large.
So there's another good question that came in on leadership. The death of two giants of social justice this year, John Lewis and now Ruth Bader Ginsburg, have brought home the need for moral leadership in the U.S. political life on these issues. How can we best honor their legacy of service and commitment to equality and inclusion?
Well, please excuse me for broadening this a little bit, but I've been having some real thoughts in recent months. I knew C.T. Vivian very, very well. We lost him this year. Jill Lowry. In fact, Martin Luther King Jr. always said of C.T. Vivian that he was the best preacher among the crowd. Jill Lowry was president of SCLC. And so now John Lewis and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, these people overcame some real challenges. When I wrote my memoirs, I called it Blessed Experiences. Now, the reason I called it that is, as I said in the introduction to the book, that all of my experiences have not been pleasant, but I've considered all of them to be blessings. And it's amazing that we are honoring John Lewis the way we are honoring him now. He didn't get that kind of honor back in 1965 when, as a 25-year-old, he led a march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge that nearly got him killed. And not only that, just think about this for a minute. John Lewis led that march that was in March, I think, if my memory serves, March 7th, 1965. The results was the Voting Rights Act, which was signed into law by Lyndon Johnson, whose bust is right here behind me, and that's Thurgood Marshall next to him. Lyndon Johnson signed that on August 6th, 6 months later. Less than a year later, John Lewis was ousted, thrown out of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Man, just think about that. A lot of people did not realize that until I started talking about it here of late. I was there when all that was going on. He got little appreciation. Think about Ruth Bader Ginsburg coming out of law school, not even be able to get a job because she was a woman, but being motivated by that. I put the two of them on par with each other. If you look at her background, what she had to overcome, to become what she became. And the same thing with John Lewis. I think we look at them and we learn from them and we practice a little bit of their life's experiences in what we do. And I think those are two best examples that we could have as to why you shouldn't give up on the system. What would have happened if they had given up? Neither one of them ever gave up. They knew what the promise was, and they stayed in pursuit of it. And so I think that is so important.
Congressman, that's a perfect note. I want to bring this to a close by focusing on leadership. If I can, you referred to the bust of Lyndon Johnson, Thurgood Marshall. You've got a portrait, I think, of Gandhi above you as well.
Right.
The Atlanta Council runs a global leadership program. In fact, we've just brought in a group of, we call them Millennium Fellows, under the age of 35, extraordinary leaders already, but really involved in a leadership accelerator. Can you talk a little bit about how you think about leadership? You were elected first when you were age 12, I think, to head an NAACP chapter. You had some tough political battles. I think I heard you in a conversation with your granddaughter after losing, I think, 3 elections. You said 3 strikes may be an out in baseball, but life is not baseball. And look at where you are. What kind of advice would you have to offer for leaders of today, particularly those who think about the connection between what's happening in our country and the role we want to play in the world?
Well, just to be fair, these other 2 busts over here happen to be W.B. Du Bois and Mary McLeod Bethune. The biggest portrait in my office is of Mary McLeod Bethune. I would say to people that you have to really make a commitment. Whatever you're committed to, make the commitment and not be deterred by the obstacles that may get in your way. Mary McLeod Bethune grew up, I think she's the 15th of 15 children, the only one to ever finish high school. And she went off to college and eventually found a college. And it's kind of interesting. But though she was born and raised in the old town of Sumter, or Maysville, right outside of Sumter, my hometown, my mother made me learn everything in the world about Mary McLeod Bethune. But she went off to Florida. Bethune-Cookman College that she found is in Florida. But the state of Florida, this is another example, just voted to take the Confederate General Statute that they have up here representing them in the Capitol, to take it out and replace it with Mary McLeod Bethune. These kinds of examples, I just believe that people have to see these kinds of examples in order to really learn to appreciate them. Now, just to be sure, that was my NAACP Youth Council. that I was president of at the age of 12. My mom and dad were not going to be following me as being the president of the NAACP chapter that they were members of and supported. But we learned from that. And in fact, that experience as a youth council in the NAACP led me, when I got to Congress, my first bill was to name the new post office in Columbia, South Carolina for Matthew J. Perry, Jr., who defended me as a lawyer when I was sitting down in Orangeburg. Because my moms took me to the courthouse in Sumter one day so I could see Matthew Perry perform in the courtroom. And she said to me, I want you to see what you can be when you grow up. So this is the kind of stuff. We have to have these kinds of examples. And that's why my homegirl, who you just introduced, and I'm sorry, it's an interesting first name that I don't remember, who's in charge of your diversity. That's why it is so important for her to be supported in that work, because we have to provide these kinds of experiences. I don't know if I ever would be sitting where I am today were it not for my mom's taking me to that courtroom that day when I first saw Matthew Perry. I saw him a few times after that because he defended me in Orangeburg, and then he became my lawyer in Columbia as well. And we became very close friends. In fact, I spoke. He asked me to be the speaker for his induction in the South Carolina Hall of Fame. All of that started with me seeing him perform in the courtroom when I was about 12 or 13 years old. So I think that what you all are doing, putting an emphasis on diversity, will help shape international thought about this country. That's got to happen. I don't see us being successful as a country if it doesn't happen. And that's what de Tocqueville saw in us way back in the 1830s. The ability to repair our faults. We got some faults. We got to get them repaired.
Congressman Clyburn, thank you for ending on that note of optimism. Thank you for your leadership and service. I can attest that mothers play a pretty important role, as you know, in shaping individuals. I think you know that well. I am going to turn it over to our fellow South Carolinian and my colleague, to Clintandra Thompson, who helps run our communications program and co-chairs our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council. And importantly for me, a fellow South Carolinian at the council. Over to you, Clintandra, to close us out.
Good afternoon, Damon. Thank you so much, House Majority Whip James E. Clyburn, for the very important and timely conversation today. You've lent your voice to the fight against systemic injustice and for stronger, more equal societies in the United States and abroad. As a point of personal privilege, I just wanted to mention that we have a mutual friendship in Mr. Bobby Gist and his brother's family, Donald and Adrian Gist and Steve and DeAndre Gist. But my appreciation from the Gists comes because they introduced my parents when they were all in grad school together. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for participating and for this very important discussion that you've led today. To our viewers, we thank you for joining us today. Don't forget to tune in for our next AC Front Page event. We have an exciting discussion with Pulitzer Prize winner and energy expert Daniel Yergin on Friday, September 25th at 9 a.m. He will speak to us about the rapidly changing energy industry disrupted by the coronavirus and rising U.S.-China tensions. Thank you so much and stay safe.
Thank you. My goodness.
My world.
Yep.